to a special episode of the Hail Married podcast. I'm A Toves and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to recap the Wilson years, talk about the kickoff of the Traylor era, and our expectations for the next 10 years of the program. We're joined again by our special guest, all the way from Sacramento, our friend and fellow tailgater, Big Brown. Welcome back, Big Brown.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So I've affectionately dubbed the Wilson years the best of times and the worst of times. Frank Wilson was announced as the second head coach for UTSA on January 14th, 2016. If you remember at this time, Larry Coker had resigned just about 9 or 10 days before that. And there had been a pretty rushed search because we were getting close to National Signing Day. The advantage, though, that UTSA had was that the American Football Coaches Association was having a convention in San Antonio at the time. So there were a lot of potential candidates who were already planning to be in town. There were many names thrown out as rumors about who might be our second head coach, and Frank Wilson sort of came out of nowhere when he was announced. In contrast to Coker, Frank Wilson had no head coaching experience at the FBS level, but was known as a strong recruiter and was generally considered to be an up-and-comer. There was a lot of excitement and optimism at this time when he was hired. What are your general thoughts about the Frank Wilson years before we really get into it?
So for me, it was sort of that new start, that kind of new energy coming into the program. I mean, with Coker, the thing was that the program had just struggled for 2 years, and it seemed, well, every coach is going to say, "Oh, give me one more year," and this thing turns around. It's almost like the relationship. Like, we've already seen what's going to happen. We have an idea of what's going on. We don't think you can turn it around. It's just not there anymore. And I think the problem was with Coker was that, he himself is not an energetic person. He might be calm in terms of, calm in chaos, but he was really just, you wouldn't see him as sort of this rah-rah guy that kind of get the guys, pumped up. So seeing Wilson kind of brought that forward. I thought really some of the places that we had struggled, especially with Coker, was the recruiting. So I was hoping that with Wilson being a renowned recruiter, that he was going to bring in some, bigger recruits, really get some good talent in there. And I think more than anything, and I'm sure Brown here is going to kind of probably go on top of this, is that from our discussions, from the three of us at the time, there was this thought that maybe that UTSA was now beginning to turn that corner. Every single time we kind of have discussed before, especially Brown and I have, we've really looked at 10 years down the road in terms of a new program, that's when, the programs really start kind of establishing themselves, really turn around. But was UTSA ahead of that curve? So, to me, it was like, here's Wilson, maybe he does propel us forward a little more. So what are your thoughts, Brown?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Obviously, I think the main thing that people kind of focused on when he first came in was the recruiting aspect. I remember reading tweets from former players at LSU that were kind of, congratulating him on getting the job and wishing him luck. And, you kind of figured, okay, if he's this really great recruiter, Texas is a great recruiting base for players, but then also he has that experience in Louisiana and Mississippi. So you just kind of felt like, okay, maybe he can kind of open this thing up to where he's getting just some really good players from, these great states and hopefully kind of help turn the program around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought that you're right. I think, hitting those fertile recruiting ground of Texas and, Louisiana and Mississippi with those establishments, you thought, maybe we'll even have some backups that'll really be good, because it was kind of with Coker at the very end. I know that Atos and I have talked about it. And JJ brought it up when we talked with him, was that the cupboard was pretty bare when he left. Yeah. So, it was at the G5 level, you kind of talk about, you needing some depth, you needing some guys, because your attrition is going to hit. For a P5 team, you can always take an injury here or there, and you've got another guy, maybe it's a 3 or 4 star that you can get in there. But here, that's not the case. And especially for this newer program, you needed, some of that depth. So that was, at least I think for me, my general thoughts.
Yeah, so I think we should kind of break this up into 2 sections. As I mentioned, kind of the best of times, and I see that as the 2016, 2017 years, and then the worst of times, the 2018 and 2019. So let's sort of focus in on those first 2 years.
Okay.
So looking back at 2016 and 2017, what are those key moments that really stick out for you guys?
Well, I think, obviously the first, easy ones that everybody will talk about is the bowl game in 2016. And then again, being bowl eligible in 2017, throughout, you get the 6 wins, and so you have the opportunity to get to the bowl games. Now, I think as we'll kind of discuss a little bit further, 2016 was quite different from 2017. 2016, there was this momentum and this excitement going to that bowl game. 2017 felt like we were more entitled towards getting to that bowl game, and the reflection on the field wasn't exactly what it was in 2016. There was a better product on the field in 2016 than there was in 2017, at least offensively. And I think that affected, though there's, I think, several other factors that people would probably bring up, I would say UTSA fans would bring up. But I think, that's what it was, that the offensive identity had really become quite conservative and quite boring. And so, defensive teams are good, and, it helps within the record. However, it's not necessarily pleasing football. So, I mean, you even seen Nick Saban change through his tenure. He was a tough defensive-minded coach, and he's now got more of a spread and just exciting offense. And he's getting some better players because of it. That just didn't happen between 2016 and 2017. But it was still good because, you had the bowl game, you had the first P5 win. You saw, honestly, looking back at stats, you had the 2016 team that scored the most points in UTSA history. And so when you look at it, I think there's certainly a lot of positives that started out, especially with the good staff that he had hired. And I thought there were some good moments, though, but I'll kind of go off to the two of you to fill in any other things.
Yeah, obviously the bowl game was huge. That was just a great moment. Also, as you mentioned, the first Power 5 win over Baylor, and granted, it was, for the most part, a kind of gutted Baylor team at that point, but it was still a Power 5 team, and for us to kind of go in and even for them being kind of a really off team from previous years, it really felt like a game that we were kind of in control of. So that was really a good moment. We, during the time frame, we kind of produced our first round draft pick in the NFL. So, there were a lot of good moments that you kind of hang on, at least, like you said, those first couple of years. But those were some of the ones that stick out to me.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to really having a good coaching staff, that Wilson was able to recruit those first 2 years. I mean, I think the other thing that he did well at that point was really trying to increase fan engagement. Obviously there's a different story when we get to the second half of his tenure, but at the beginning of his tenure, he had moved the Spirit Walk, so that it was a little bit more engaging, kind of through the tailgating space to come into the Alamo Dome. He had the National Signing Day event. He, brought about the tradition of the come and take it flag. So it seemed like, those first couple of years, he really was trying to help, UTSA kind of turn the corner, get fans more engaged, build some traditions, and obviously when we get to the second half of the tenure, we can talk about the flip side of that coin.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the points you guys bring up. I would say in terms of one thing just to bring up for 2017 is, we talked about the offensive side in 2016. In 2017, when we do have Marcus Davenport become the first number 1 draft pick in UTSA history, we also have the best defense in UTSA history. We allow the fewest yards in a season that season, and we only allowed it was close to 3,200 yards, which kind of came out to about 290 yards per game, which, even now is huge, especially some of the teams you play. And we allowed the least points ever in terms of in UTSA history again. And, it's 187 points, but it comes out to 17 per game. I mean, that's huge. Like when we talk about other Roadrunner teams, even the current one, they're still about a touchdown and a 2-point conversion off from what that team produced. So I don't think that the depth was necessarily there yet, but there was that talent was there and it was coached well enough. And, when I've talked about sort of the assistants, we got to talk about, I think, the coordinators that were huge, which is Frank Selfo and Pete Golding. Pete Golding mostly gets a lot of the I think a lot of the star status because he's gone now to be the Alabama defensive coordinator. But, he really did turn around that defense those 2 years. Frank Selfo, even though we have problems with how the 2017 season went, and, I think there was a lot of Wilson, I would say, I don't know, micromanagement within there that we probably need to discuss a little further. Frank Selfo also did one big thing, and that was he got our first quarterback to get invited to a pro camp, and that was Dalton Sturm got invited to the Dallas Cowboys training camp. I mean, he wasn't able to, do much with the Cowboys, unfortunately, but that's still huge. I mean, the premier position that you have on the team, which is quarterback, and which is the most important position we've talked about in terms of having some sort of consistency, a UTSA quarterback gets to the NFL. Like, that to me was huge too. So I think once we start getting, I think, some better, obviously we've talked about it too, is there'll be other people that'll trump this, but at this point, these are nice, good memories and, good starts to a program.
So, we've mentioned Marcus Davenport and Dalton Sturm, but who are those other players that really kind of stick out in your mind from those first 2 years?
Well, I think Josiah, right?
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth there. Yeah. I mean, that's really, the player that kind of sticks out in my head the most. And really kind of one of the key moments that, I was kind of writing down some notes before meeting up with you guys. And I kind of remember the UTSA game against North Texas, with the all black unis, October 29th. And, Josiah hurdling a player to sack the quarterback, and to me, I mean, that kind of like almost felt like the pinnacle of like, when everything was really going right during the Wilson era. That was just like that one play that really sticks out in my mind.
Yeah.
I mean, I completely agree. I think, in terms of other players, I think just because I kind of talked about it before, it was just, we seem to have these kind of physical safeties, and that tradition kind of continues. And I think it's sort of this small underlying lining thing for like UTSA teams. Like we've had good safeties. And so I just remember Nate Gaines, Michael Egwagu, just key players on that defense. You had these safeties that were like really creating plays. You end up having Carl Austin a little bit later, but he's still on this team, and he's a young player on that team. So those are a couple guys. But I think another big one is Yanni Rutsis, is his career during this time. I think much like Lucas Dean, he kind of started writing his own book as soon as he was a freshman because of the fact that he was just a good punter. And he just kept improving. And I know special teams is not the sexiest of sides of the ball, but the fact that he was, our punters have been able to at least help kind of both sides of the ball, give good field position or turn field position. It's just key here. So.
Yeah. And I think, you got to talk about Jarvion, because up until this year, this is when Jarvion was really hitting his stride and was, setting all of the records in terms of, running backs, only to be, back here as a coach now and see his record fall. But there was a lot of years there that Jarvion really held pretty much all of the records in terms of running backs.
That's true.
Absolutely.
So, looking back at this era, who are the notable recruits, that have come out of this 2016 and 2017 class? Because I think, we really talk about Wilson and we talk about, his recruiting prowess, particularly when it comes to the 2019 teams. But any recruits from the 2016, 2017 class that kind of stand out for you guys?
I mean, for 2017, you did have Frank Harris, who comes out. He sticks out. BJ Daniels, which I think when you look back at his career, it was almost a lot like the Wilson era. There was a lot of what could have been, but just never was. I don't know that BJ was ever going to be a great running back. I think it's because of his upright style, just kind of hampered him some. But he was a physical guy, and I think he had a couple moments, at least this season, where you got to kind of see him what some of the things he could do, but it just never kind of materialized. The other things I think is you start seeing guys like Jalen Haynes and Josh Dunlap being an offensive tackle, Jalen Haynes being big on the defensive side of the ball, that at least from the 2017 side were big. That first class, though, I got to say for Wilson, the toughest part for him was that he came in so late. So he had to try to solidify all sorts of things. And to get guys like Devron Davis and Solomon Wise, who just graduated now and is a graduate transfer, Josh Otis, Stephon Beard, Eric Banks, who ends up going to the Rams, Les Maru. I think I say his name right. If not, sorry about that, Les. But those are just some guys that, stick out and just made names for themselves during this, or started making their names for themselves during the first couple Wilson years.
Yeah, I think we didn't really necessarily see these guys in some cases make as much of an impact in 2016 and 2017, but you're sort of seeing, the last year in 2019 and then into 2020, kind of seeing some of these guys really become integral parts of our 2D. All right. So anything else on the 2016, 2017 years before we move into the lean years?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I've got to bring up is, and I'll let Atos kind of expand on this a little bit more, but before, I was throwing out random tweets, or actually Brown and I were throwing out random tweets, whether it's about UTSA or whatever. In 2016, at some point, I had told Atobes here from our seats, Wilson's not the guy. Mm-hmm. There was something that stuck out to me that said he's not the guy that we think he is. He's going to do some good things here, but he's not the guy. So I'll let you expand on that, because I don't really remember when I said it. I just know that I had started seeing things early on, and then as it kept going on, it really bothered me. And so I finally just blurted it out to you.
Yeah, I feel like it was kind of maybe towards the end of the first season. I know it was sort of around his game management. I don't remember what exactly happened or what game. I just know we were in the Alamo Dome, and you had leaned over and you're like, yeah, I don't know if he's the guy, if he can't fix these issues, this is going to be a problem. But it was like everyone was still in that like Wilson honeymoon phase. I mean, we were on our way to potentially having a first bowl invite. And admittedly, I thought you were crazy at the time, but apparently you were not.
Or being a negative Nelly. But
yeah,
and it's one of those things that kind of sticks out to you. But, I guess one of the things that I'll bring up right now is the fact that one of the things that always bothered me about Frank Wilson was that, unlike Coker and Traylor, he had this huge laminated sheet where he had, like, I guess, every single offensive and defensive play. So to me, it spoke a lot of, we have a lot of ideas. We're not really sure what's going to work, but we're going to throw it out there. We might not perfect everything, but we're going to just throw it out there. And, but we're going to be prepared during the game to maybe run this one play that we ran a couple times and, should be all right. But it just didn't seem like we were as buttoned up as we could be.
Well, just kind of going off of that, what are those early red flags that we should have seen maybe from those first 2 years that we didn't quite identify until later on?
Well, with Wilson, I think one of the flags that kind of stuck out to me, and honestly, maybe it didn't stick out to me that early. I think it maybe kind of, you guys noticed it, but, and I've mentioned this before, but I'll kind of say it again, the Mike Tyson quote about, everybody having a plan until they get punched in the face. And, with Wilson, there were definitely moments where it's like UTSA would get punched in the face, and it just seemed like he didn't know how to adjust. Mm-hmm. And especially given the fact that he has this huge, sheet of all these plays, you think, okay, there's got to be something that's going to work on here. But it just seemed that that he could never really adjust the game plan to the way the game was going. Like, he just more or less, had this tunnel vision of, okay, this is how we're going to win this game. And when it wouldn't happen, then it just kind of started to fall to the wayside. So that was one of the flags that, definitely kind of stuck out somewhat early.
Yeah, I think one of the things looking back, of course, it's always easy looking back, hindsight's 2020.
Right.
One of the things that I think should have stood out to me more, and then I don't know if I didn't realize it at the time or I just didn't pay attention, was I was looking back at some of the interviews, and to start the 2016 season, Wilson didn't tell Dalton he was the starter until the morning of the very first game. So there was a quarterback battle, and uncertainty between him and what was his name? Jaron Johnson? Was that the?
Yeah.
Until the very morning of our first game. So to me, that just kind of goes back to the point of, did he really have a plan? And why couldn't he have, made a decision between those two guys quicker? And then, his decision was, Dalton, you start, but then I'm going to put Johnson in the second quarter, and we're going to, kind of flip flop back and forth between the two of them. So, again, if that was your plan, if you're going to play two quarterbacks, did you really need to wait until breakfast to figure out which of the two you're going to start? It just doesn't seem like, that was very good coaching. And again, probably should have planted a seed that there was maybe going to be some issues during his tenure.
And I think there too, you want to look back at Frank Silfo and say, this is who we need to start, and we just need to announce it now and just move forward. But it kind of began that feeling of like you said, there's no plan, but there should have been something better sealed up there between the two of them, just to make sure that those guys are ready and they're prepared. I mean, but there's that old adage that if you have two quarterbacks, you don't have any quarterbacks at all. So, again, I think we started talking about this the first time we talked about the Coker years, but again, here's Dalton Stern kind of being overlooked again, not really given that chance to get the keys to the franchise, even though he was clearly the franchise quarterback for UTSA. So yeah, I mean, those are I think some of the biggest issues there.
So that leads us into the lean years of 2018 and 2019, or the worst of times. So what are those key moments that kind of stand out for you guys during this era?
I think there was some hope, I guess, with Al Borges coming in that, we were past this boring offense. But I think this is when we start talking about Wilson and his recruiting backfiring on him, because Wilson's recruiting guys, but he's not recruiting to an identity. He's recruiting just guys. And that's one thing to just bring in talent. But if it doesn't fit together, if it's such a mismatch, then it's hard to come together and say, yeah, we're a running team, but we don't really have great running backs. We don't really have great blockers. The wide receivers are okay. It's like you start seeing all the problems that we kind of started seeing in 2016 and 2017 are now really manifesting themselves in that offensive coordinator moment. Just to talk about key moments, 2018 games 7 through 11. It's 5 games, 30 total points UTSA scored, and they gained 1,067 total yards. That's ridiculous, especially in this era of such free open offenses. I mean, that's how bad and how lean you talked about lean years. This is how lean it gets right here. I mean, never mind the scores, because the scores are as bad as you probably think it is, but not being able to manifest anything on offense, it's just stick a fork in UTSA and start putting the for sale signs on Wilson's era there.
Well, yeah. And I probably should have said this earlier, but, kind of going into this time period, you've got, Wilson, who had been up for, was it the Ole Miss job in 2017? Yeah, I think
he interviewed, yes.
He'd interviewed for a job. It kind of seemed like he was going to leave. We've got this sort of panic among the fan base, that Wilson's going to leave when he made us bowl eligible 2 years in a row, even though, we got left on the shelf in 2017. He ends up staying. He gets this contract extension or enhancement or whatever. And so you've kind of got, okay, great. We've got our coach. He's still here. Things are going to be okay. But then you've got this exodus of assistants, during this time. So Pete Golding leaves. He fires Selfo. So it's almost like, we had a lot of hopes, but we were should have seen the writing on the wall that things weren't necessarily going to be great in 2018.
And those connections weren't there. Like, it seemed like he looked into his staff to try to fill some of these coordinator positions, but I don't know that those guys are, and again, hindsight's 50-50, but it's clear those guys were not coordinator guys. They're maybe good coaches, position coaches, but in terms of being coordinators, they're not there. So this is where you start seeing a lot of those flaws.
Well, I'm going to start by saying I love it when my notes match exactly what you guys are saying. So it means I'm on the same page as you guys. but and kind of to piggyback off of all that, one of the things was that, and granted, it could have been Wilson's own undoing, but just the fact that he never had a quarterback that he was completely comfortable with. One of the things that you can compare it to it is you look at like North Texas, where they had a Mason Fine, and that was like the program quarterback there. That was the guy that was going to be on all the billboards and all flyers and everything. And as much as I love Dalton Sturm, you could tell that there was never a point that Wilson really felt completely comfortable to where he had the keys to the program and he was the one that was driving the car. And, you saw it where he just always kind of did that 2 quarterback system, which for the life of me, I still don't understand what the purpose of that was. But yeah, that was definitely something that I feel kind of went wrong. I don't know if he had stuck with Dalton Sturm, and just, kind of made that choice and rode with it, if things would have been different. But that definitely caused a lot of anger amongst the fan base.
So I like that point that you made, because 2016 and 2017, one thing we didn't talk about was that it was more of a sort of a pro style offense, very LSU-like, where it was line up, we're going to be smash mouth. So you kind of had the pieces fit together. But when I talked about sort of this recruiting where he just getting guys, he never figures out what that offense is. And so he starts bringing in like dual athlete quarterbacks, and he's got pro style quarterbacks. So you have a mishmash in the quarterback room. So it's like, well, what are we running? Because Bryce Rivers was brought in. He's a tall, big dude, but he's a pro style quarterback. He is not dual threat at all.
Neither is JoJo, who we also recruited during this time.
Yeah. But you have Frank Harris, who I think now we can say maybe he is, maybe he's not, but he's much more that mold than a pro style quarterback. Like, he definitely can run around and scramble. So because of that lack of identity, because of all this stuff that's going on, again, to Brown's point, not solidifying that position and not being able to say, this is the type of quarterback we need to be bringing into the quarterback room, and this is what we're going to coach to. And if it gets me fired, it gets me fired, but I'm going to be a pro style offense or a pro style spread offense. It just never gets there. And it's so tough with him.
Yeah, and that's where, I think going back to him not having a plan B, you see, okay, he didn't get the job, so now he's stuck at UTSA. Probably didn't really have a plan for what happens in year 3 and 4, because I think he thought in his mind he was going to be gone after year 2. So, now we kind of see some disarray there. He's got his 2 key coordinators that are gone that he's got to replace. He doesn't seem to have a backup plan really to replace those 2 with the right folks. You see it again when we have quarterback injuries. You've got this mishmash of quarterbacks, and so he's not able to kind of adjust and flex. And I think the biggest example is the 2019 North Texas game when Frank Harris goes down. He puts in Lowell. They don't necessarily play the same way, and yet he keeps, this certain game plan in his mind. And he said, well, we're not going to change our game plan for the quarterback. It's like, but you need to, because at that time, Lowell was not an accurate passer. You needed to adjust your plays, and yet he's just stuck in this mindset. Nope, I'm not going to do it. And I think that's just, again, where the wheels start to fall off.
This is the one time where, they've talked about head coaches where if you start appeasing the fans, like, you'll end up being in the seats with them. I think this is the one time that a coach really needed to listen to the fans, because I think everybody was, and you could, when I say everybody, there's a lot of people, analysts and other writers that were seeing this and saying, no, this is what they really should be doing. And he refused to bow to it. And as we've talked about before, this is where, and the lean times too, where he now really disassociates from the fans, even though we still have those moments when, he gets off the, we get off the bus and he's going, and he's doing smiling, giving the birds up to everybody, kind of shaking hands and everything. On Twitter, he starts blocking people. He's, there's this just backlash towards everybody. There's no more, and we didn't really talk about this, but there's no more all hands on deck. Like, that's completely disappeared. Like, now it's just us, the team, against the world. And once you start getting into that mentality, to me, it's just like, this is my last stand. This is my Alamo. I've got nothing else. I'm being surrounded, and I think I can fight it out with my few guys, and we'll give a valiant effort. But, either way, it's going to end badly.
Well, it was interesting. I was trying to think about what were the key games during this period, and it's sort of tough to come up with, games to really be excited about during the 2018-2019 season. I think the games that I remember are not for the right reasons.
I mean, I think the key one, I think, is going back to what you said, was 2019 UNT, because that was the moment I think that Frank Wilson was officially fired. He was allowed to play it out. I don't think there was another, even though Jason Rollins was on the staff, I don't think he was going to do anything to turn this, this sinking ship, right it or do anything. Jeff Castle had become the offensive coordinator, and I was more enthused about it because I felt like, looking back, had he been the choice instead of Al Borges, I think there's more continuity, and I think he's able to adjust more to things. I'm not saying he's going to be perfect. I don't think that, he does anything splashy, but he started bringing some things to the table that hadn't seen at UTSA in a long time. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, 2019 UNT, and I think it's because we were there.
Yeah.
And we unfortunately sat through probably one of the worst games ever. That just sticks out of my mind because we drove 4.5 hours essentially to see a terrible product on the field.
Yeah, is it bad if I've already purged those 2 years from my memories? I can't really say anything's memorable about that time. I think I've kind of blocked it out, like my own self-therapy. But
I mean, I will say this, like, I will say this, just to kind of let the listeners know a little bit about Brown here. He is the most optimistic person. He, even during those lean UTSA years, he would always find something great to say, or find a silver lining. And the fact that during that time he was having problems doing that itself was another kind of marker that things are going wrong, because even he can't come up and say, oh yeah, but we have this. Like, he was struggling to find but we have nope.
Yeah.
The good note that comes out of this year, if we go back and we look at the recruiting classes, of course, we all talk about 2019, but even if you go back and you look at 2018, again, the one thing that Frank Wilson did, despite his head coaching struggles, was, he did bring in some good recruits. Not necessarily, again, I think the big miss was recruiting to an offensive identity. But, if you go back, you look at just some of the players that he brought in and what they've been able to do, over this last year, and you could kind of start to see some potential in them during this time period. But, obviously the coaching and the coordinators and everything was sort of lacking. But I mean, you've got, Brendan Brady coming in during this time period, Sheldon Jones, you've got Lorenzo Dantzler, just a lot of players. Maka came in 2018.
Yeah, he did.
We all know how
2019. Sorry, 2019.
Oh, he was 2019. Okay.
Yeah.
Clutchy was in 2018. So, I mean, you see a lot of these guys that are big playmakers, come in over those 2 years.
Yeah, the one player that I think probably sticks out to me, because I've literally fallen in love with him over the last couple of years, is Lowell Narcisse. He was originally at LSU, if I'm not mistaken, then kind of jumped around JUCO and kind of made it here. And I remember me and Atos kind of having a conversation about this, where I think at the time we were kind of sour on some of the grad transfers coming in, because, over the years they hadn't panned out quite how we had expected them to. And, we'd kind of mentioned that at the JUCO level, he had some rough games there, and maybe he was this big body, he definitely was a D1 type player as far as size wise, but he just hadn't produced. And when we first saw him, accuracy wasn't there, had a rocket for an arm, but couldn't hit the side of the barn, as they say. But just over the years, you kind of see him just really develop his game, start to be able to run and also throw, and just become this really physical player. But he's really kind of developed well. So that was, I guess, one of the good things that kind of came out of this era. You just kind of see Lowell kind of really develop into a really solid player, at least somebody that I really am a huge fan of.
Side note, everybody, he is in Sacramento, California, but he still has a Texan in him as he gave the whole, couldn't hit the side of a barn. I love it. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think Lowell is just one of that great redemption stories that I think for UTSA, I think it's going to just live in UTSA history. I mean, it's just great to see what he was able to achieve. And I think, obviously when we start talking about the 2019 class, obviously you have some linchpins here and Rashad and Sincere, who, I'll be honest with everybody, I didn't think were going to really fulfill to what they've done at this point, only because I felt like the coaching staff at the time, which is Wilson and his coordinators and his coaching and his other coaches, weren't going to be able to maximize their abilities. That's where I felt like, if anything, we look back at some of these years, we got some good players, but some of them maybe never got to get maximized.
All right, well, let's get into the categories. So we've got a couple of categories similar to what we talked about in the Coker years. First is rewatchable game. So what is that one game during any of the era of Frank Wilson that you would love to rewatch or re-experience, but you can't change the outcome?
For me, it's going to be, I had one I thought that I wanted to rewatch, but I think it's the 2017 North Texas game in Denton. That's the game where we're up, we punt the ball, and North Texas drives and scores the winning touchdown late. And I know Alamo Audible has talked about it before, but it seems like that's when things really started spiraling for that season with Frank Wilson, because you essentially snatched defeat out of a win. They blitzed on, one of the plays, and it gave up like a 30 or 40 yard pass to really put the momentum in North Texas's hands. So, we could paint it rosy, but I think when we're talking about the Wilson era, I think that's going to stick out to me as, if we could change the outcome, I know what you're saying, you can't change it, but if you could change it and it did win, does that change what goes on? I don't know, but it's a tough one.
You just went all straight negative there, huh?
I did. All
right. What about you, Brown?
Well, I mentioned earlier the North Texas game. That one sticks out. But the one that I actually jotted down, and the one for whatever reason it kind of sticks in my head, is the 2016 Middle Tennessee game where we end up winning 45-25. We're on the road in Middle Tennessee, and I remember I was moving that day, so I was just listening to the game on the radio, and I actually turned on the game probably, I think, late in third quarter, and saw that we were up huge at the time. And I don't know why specifically that game sticks out to me. I think it was just because I didn't expect us to win that game. Mm-hmm. And then also, when you're kind of looking back, we were bowl eligible that year. So obviously this game was key to us being able to be bowl eligible. So that one's, I guess, one of the ones that, had I not been moving or anything, I would have loved to actually just been able to kind of like watch the game and kind of see how everything kind of played out. So that one kind of, for whatever reason, just seems to live in my head.
And I think for me, it's got to be the Baylor game, just because, it was an away game. It was, us really, being able to go into a P5 school, come away with a win, even though it was a Baylor team that was, depleted. I just remember the excitement from the fans that were there. And, I think that was, will be one of the great wins of this era.
That's fair. Sticking with my negativity, though.
All right. So what do we think is the biggest missed opportunity that could have swung the Wilson era?
Do you want to take it, Tobes? So I have quite a few jotted down. Which one will I pick? So initially, losing the bowl game was definitely the first one that I jotted down. Actually, as we were talking, it kind of got me thinking. And I don't know if this necessarily swings the Wilson era, but I do think that it definitely maybe have changed something, was the loss against Arizona State in 2016, where, it felt at a certain point that we were going to pull out the game. And, of course, Arizona State realized, hey, we're a P5 school. We're not losing this game. It makes me just wonder, especially with the game, being on national television. I believe it was a Friday game, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
If he wins that game, granted, he might not even have stuck around for another year or whatever if he beats Arizona State, but it would have been interesting to see what happens if we were able to pull that one out.
Yeah, I think if Wilson had left after 2017, the narrative about the Wilson era would be completely different, because he would have left after 2017. Yeah, we would have had the bowl disappointment, but I think there'd be a lot of, man, what could have been if Wilson would have stayed. I think people would have just remembered those bowl victories, the Baylor win, all of the kind of good stuff from the first 2 years. Obviously, the narrative is completely different in the second half of his tenure, not just based on the field performance, but also based on his behavior and interaction with the fans.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that was my thing too, is he leaves after 2017. And what does that mean? Where does UTSA go next? And I think we remember him more fondly than we do now. I think everybody just doesn't like him. Obviously the fit he throws when he leaves, some of the things he said that focused away from his weaknesses. So yeah, I mean, I think that to me is, if 2017 he leaves for another job, I think he's remembered really well.
Yeah, and a couple of other unanswerable questions I have from the Wilson era. Why did he turn on the past players? It seemed like, not only did he turn on the fans, but he also turned on, some of the players from, the Coker era. And it just didn't quite seem to make sense to me why, there wasn't sort of this willingness to embrace, UTSA past players, regardless of where they came from. I mean, if you believe what's said on Twitter by some of these former players, it was very much like, you're not my guy and you're not welcome here.
Yeah, I always kind of think of Wilson and really try to, I guess, maybe empathize with him, especially when you kind of see some of the backlash that he received over Twitter. And by no means am I saying that he didn't deserve, a good amount of that backlash, but with him not really having that head coaching experience, the one thing I've kind of just casually noticed with coaches from watching football is if you're a good enough coach, you've probably been fired a few times over the course of your career.
Yeah.
And I think at a certain point you kind of maybe gain a perspective of how to get fired, how to kind of bow out gracefully. And, it kind of felt that Wilson maybe didn't have that level of experience. And, I really wish, one of the things that I actually did jot it down is, what if he had just left? Not necessarily, nothing changes as far as history goes. He still gets fired, but he just leaves and just says, hey, it didn't work out, and I move on. Because, and not really trying to, move too far ahead, but he leaves a pretty damn good cupboard when he leaves. He leaves a lot of ingredients left in the kitchen, not to mention quarterbacks, which is something that, we've always kind of had issues with. He left, a decent amount of quarterbacks to kind of choose from, for the next coach coming in. So, I just kind of wonder, if he had that maybe wisdom to say, just walk away. Don't try to slam the door or yell on your way out, if maybe he was perceived differently by the fans.
Sure.
So my one unanswerable question was really, what if we don't offer that contract restructure after 2016? Because he gets his contract restructured after that. He essentially gets a raise. And I think it changed the perception of Wilson. I think the three of us don't feel like that was as big of a deal. We have a problem with how much he was paid, but because of the fact that he was paid so highly and the results in the field did not match his, even close to his salary, or even the product was matching what he was getting paid, it really it further soured it. And, just as an example, look at Seth Luttrell right now at North Texas. He's had some down years and he is around the salary or even a little bit higher than what Wilson was at. And he's facing such harsh backlash for not being able to put together a good product. So I think, if, whatever happens there, but if he doesn't do anything with that, and it was a bad buyout, by the way, like we weren't going to get paid much if he did leave. But I think looking back, if Lynn Hickey doesn't go and rush to do that and, push that some more, what happens then?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that there would be quite as bitter a feeling for him, but maybe I'm wrong. So just to wrap up the Wilson era, how do we think that his legacy will be defined?
Obviously, the fans are going to have, their thoughts on him, and I don't think a lot of those thoughts are very fond or they're very nice. I like to think that, I think he really tried to succeed. I think at a certain point, he just wasn't able to make the adjustments needed to succeed. The one thing that I think will always stick out with me is, obviously the great recruiter. He brought in some really good players, but also he seemed to really care about the kids. That was one of the things that, at least I got across with the kids that he actually brought in and were in a program. It seemed that he really seemed to care about them, and that kind of mattered to me.
I think in terms of his legacy, it's, just unfulfilled promise. Like, he was his first time head coach. He hadn't been a coordinator. And I think we were all hoping, and even to this point, even the most, negative fan, I think would have to admit that if he had just maybe relinquished a little bit of control, maybe not acted the manner he did in 2018 and 2019, I think everybody was rooting for him, but he just made it hard to be a fan of his. And so just that unfulfilled promise, I think, is always going to stick out.
Yeah. I think the thing that will be tough, in the long term, looking back at the Frank Wilson era is, you always remember your first. And so Larry Coker, even though he had those last 2 years that were not great, he will always be remembered fondly for being the guy that started the program. Right now he still has the most winning record in UTSA history, but when you look at the things that we achieved over the Wilson era, your first bowl game, first P5 win, those can very easily be replaced when we get to the first bowl win and the first win over a ranked program. So I think, the sad thing for Wilson is that, his accomplishments will be forgotten once we achieve, those two things in the future. And it probably won't be long. I mean, it could be Traylor, maybe the person after that, but.
That's fair enough.
All right. So now that the Traylor year is a year old, we've talked a lot about Traylor over the podcast. The one question I have is, looking at the Traylor era, we've started off with a bowl game. We've started off with a winning season. Is this a deja vu, or is the Traylor era set up to be different than the Wilson era?
I think it's different in that he has decided on a culture, what he wants his team to look like. He's got an offensive identity. We've talked about on the podcast about the quarterbacks, and, I've been critical about Frank and some of the other quarterbacks, but when you look at who he's recruiting to a certain recipe that he wants. The quarterbacks that he's looked at, he recruited Adkins, and he's recruited the kid out of the Valley, Eddie Lee Marburger. Both of them look similar. They don't look complete opposites from each other. So you can tell right away he's looking for a certain quarterback in a certain mold. He's looking for players, the different positions that he wants to fit what he wants. And so while there is some deja vu to it, I think at least after 1 year, I think there's a little bit more hope because of the fact that he does have that plan in place or that idea in his head of what he wants this team to look like, as opposed to, I think what was a little more difficult for Wilson was that, again, the cupboard was empty and he was having to kind of restock everything by himself and figure that all out. Whereas Traylor's now seen the history and probably learned from looking at some of the mistakes and making sure he doesn't make those mistakes. So that, to me, I think is going to be the major difference. Now, if we're here about a year from now or 4 years from now, and I will admit, hey, I was wrong, but I don't think we're going to be wrong on this one.
What about you, Brad?
Yeah, again, you're kind of taken directly from my notes there. I think one of the things with Traylor is that, he does have the benefit of being able to see what happened just before him. So it makes it a little bit easier not to kind of make those same mistakes and kind of, retread over those same issues. And you kind of see it already playing out, even as something as simple as the helmet. There was a lot of fans that weren't happy, when Wilson was trying to do the branding with the Texas logo. And, Traylor comes right in and doesn't make any type of big deal about it. The helmet just changes, and so, there's that. Even with, and granted, maybe you guys can speak to this a little better than I can, but I remember hearing that there was maybe I don't necessarily want to call it an issue, but just with Wilson's relationship with some of the coaches and around Texas and specifically even locally in San Antonio. And, you kind of see Traylor come in and he immediately starts, kind of building these relationships with a lot of these coaches. So, it definitely seems that Traylor is definitely paid attention to what went wrong, and he's trying to make sure that he doesn't go down that same road. So that's definitely a positive thing to see.
Yeah, and I think, when we look at the Traylor era, for me, year 3 is going to be the defining year. When you go back and look at the Coker era, year 3 of FBS, when you look at the Wilson era, year 3, those are the 2 years where the wheels just fall off for both coaches. So I'll be really interested to see what happens in year 3 of the Traylor era, to see if we can, continue to have kind of this upward trajectory, or, do we fall back into that pattern, which just seems to be, an issue with UTSA. So when we're sitting here doing our 20-year retrospective, what are those things that we want to see in this next 10 years of the program? Or how are we measured success over the next 10 years of the program?
So I think the first thing really to talk about is, you said year 3, things fall off. Well, I think that there's data, if we go back and look at, and I know that Brown and I had talked about this before when we've looked at some of these programs that have been developed over the last, I think it was like 20 years, 25 years. We've noticed that in year 10, that's when these programs finally kind of start turning the corner. And I think that this really has to be the big thing for Traylor to start off the 10 years, is to really make sure, solidify that the recruiting, he's got the Texas high school background. So I think that that's kind of the difference between him and Wilson, was that, he knew these guys, so he can get right in the door easily, as opposed to Wilson, where I think Wilson had to talk them into certain things in order to get in the door. So I think really solidifying the recruiting pipelines and really be building a consistent winner. It's one thing to just be able to beat Rice, UTEP in Conference USA, but I think as you continue looking forward, those are wins, and I hate to say it this way, but you got to say it this way, is those have to be the locked in wins. And then you have to take over Southern Miss, La Tech, and North Texas in order for you to say, okay, now we're being a consistent winner on the G5 level. We need to start kind of, and we have seen some of that close the gap with the P5, but I think it's being able to upset these P5s and really start competing consistently with them, as opposed to having just a really good game with them and being able to say, oh, look, we went up to Provo and it was 27-20, when in reality, if you really took an objective look at the game, it wasn't maybe as that big of a chance for an upset as it really was. So those are my thoughts, I think, in terms of what these next 10 years should bring.
For me, I think, obviously winning on the field is important. Seeing us, get to bowl games, seeing us be more competitive in the Conference USA Championship is important. But I also want to see, that we increase our fan support.
Yeah, well, so, obviously out here in California, I've been in lockdown for a while, so it's given me quite a bit of time to think about the future of UTSA and everything. And I've probably put more thought to it than I care to kind of divulge here. But, I think the thing that I've really been thinking about over the next 10 years is this season in particular, with some of the games being televised, I got a chance to watch, but I also got a chance to share with some of the people that we know out here in California, and I'm like, hey, my alma mater's playing, check out the game. It's going to be on ESPN or CBS or whatever. And, they kind of watch the games and are like, man, are really intrigued by the way they play and the style of play. And really the one thing that kind of carried through is that nobody seemed to really know who UTSA was. And, the the thing that it kind of sticks out to me is that, when you're 10 years old, you're cute, you're, this cute kid. But, as we start to get older and we get closer to being 20, 21, you're not really cute anymore. All of a sudden people actually know the name and they, like, oh yeah, I know that school. So I think over the next 10 years, is kind of when we need to start to kind of solidify our brand, but also solidify just the program itself to where, in another 10 years when, it's no longer, oh, who's UTSA? And it's more like, oh yeah, we know who that school is. It'd be nice for us to kind of be an established program and hopefully be established with a positive reputation, be the school that, obviously ideally Traylor's probably going to be gone at some point, but hopefully he's gone because he's moving on to bigger and better things. But, hopefully he kind of leaves the position where there's other coaches out there saying, man, I really want that UTSA job because, you can recruit really well out of there. They have, good facilities, it's just a great opportunity for the next coach coming in. So that's kind of what I hope to see in the next 10 years.
Yeah, and I agree. I think in terms of the coaches, and I think for the fan base, they can't be afraid to look at UTSA as a stepping stone. And that's one thing I really go back to when we look back at these first 10 years. It's one of the first things that Brown over here had talked to me about in the parking lot after a game was, this can be a good stepping stone for somebody's career. And I think early on, it didn't really seem that way. Coker wasn't going to go to another team, no matter how much success he had. No one was going to be knocking on his door hoping he's there. Wilson is that type of coach that would be. But we can't look at this, the program and think we don't want somebody to just stepstone. We want them to here for 20, for 10, 15 years. It's not going to happen. That's not where UTSA is at. So we've got to get benefit out of that coach too. If they breed success, then we need to build on that success, their success, and be able to, kind of like what Brown said, you can be successful at UTSA because of these 10 things. And because of that, that's what makes this a cool opportunity. But there are some national people now that are really looking at UTSA and have, because of the season, have started saying, this is a little bit better opportunity than you can get because you're in Texas. And that, I think, is one of the biggest recruiting positions for a coach to come to.
All right. Well, thanks, Brown, for joining us on our special episode looking back at the Wilson era. We had a lot of fun kind of talking about both the Wilson era and the last special episode that we did on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. As always, it's just great to kind of get with you guys and talk some UTSA football, especially being so far apart from each other now.
And thanks to all of our listeners for joining us on this special episode of the Hail Married podcast. I'm Atos.
I'm the Toves.
Not sure when we'll be back, maybe with the spring game, but we look forward to talking to all of you guys again.
Birds up.